So in my previous video, we looked at how to handle errors. We looked at how we could trap them using a standard try-catch type of approach. And that was good because we sent an email at the end of that to go to somebody, whether it's a help desk, whether it's to a support person, who can then go and start to figure out what the issue is. But all we did was send an email. What we're going to do now is start to provide some contextual information. So in this scenario, we are going to create a link directly to the flow run that has failed. So just as a recap, here's the flow that we created in part 1, where we triggered it manually. All we did was create a data type mismatch error, which meant that my main flow, my try scope, was going to fail, and so it was going to fall straight through into my catch. And all my catch is doing is sending an email to somebody to say that something has gone wrong, you need to fix it. But it doesn't really contain any more information than that. So what I want to do is bring whoever is going to be diagnosing the issue directly into the flow that's failed. Because if I've got a lot of flows that are running, I mean here, they've all failed because of where I've been testing. But what I want to do is bring them directly to this URL. So let's have a closer look at what we've actually got contained in this URL. Because this is what I need to build. So I have a fully qualified domain name. So we're going to need that. Other key pieces of information is the environment ID itself. So I need to find out what that is. I need to know what the flow ID is. So the actual internal ID of the actual automation that I'm going to try and come back to. And then the ID of the individual run. So for this particular flow, most of this will stay fairly static. And the only part that will change is the run. But what I want to do is create something that's fairly reusable, something that can stand on its own, that I could potentially just copy between all my flows and it will just start working. So we're going to build this to be as dynamic as we possibly can. So I'm going to go and edit my flow. And the way that I like to approach this is I always like to have a scope at the front of my flows, which is going to provide my support information. Okay, and in here, I'm going to start to build up that entire URL so I can then use it throughout the rest of my flow. So I'm going to go and add an action. And in here, I'm going to add a compose action because I don't need to go and update it again later. And all I'm going to say is that this is my fully qualified domain name. So this is the first part of my flow run URL. And all I'm going to do is grab the HTTPS and bring all that through into my fully qualified domain name. So this at the moment is the one thing that I can't find dynamically. So I'm putting this in statically, and but doing it here, it means that I can quite easily change this each time I need to reuse it. But then I need to get the rest of this now to start building up my entire URL. So how do I get that? So I'm going to add another compose action. And this time I'm going to call this compose. Let's call this my flow info. And in my expression editor, I have an expression called workflow. And all I need to do is type workflow, open close brackets, hit OK, and that will now start to give me some information. And that information is really useful going forward because it's going to give me pretty much everything else that I need. So I'm just going to save this and we're just going to run it just so that we can see what we get back from it. Okay, so in my support info, I can see my fully qualified domain name, but this is what I'm interested in, my flow info. Okay, so from the workflow expression, I get a lot of really useful information. Let's just pull that back into Notepad. So what do I get? I get the ID. I get a name, you can see that I get a location, so I get some contextual information to this specific run. What is really useful is things such as the name, which is the actual run ID itself. I've got the environment name. Some of those key things that I pointed out in the full URL previously are now here. So let's remind ourselves of what we needed. We needed the environment name, we needed the flow ID and the run ID. So all of that is located here. So let's start to break it out a little bit. So I'm going to make this a little bit more usable so that I can start using some dynamic content. So I'm going to pass the JSON that comes back from my flow info. The content is going to be the outputs of my flow info, and I'm going to build the schema from the JSON that I copied out of the last run. So now that that's been passed, each of these objects I can now, or each of these pieces of information that have contained within this pass step now, I can use as dynamic content, which makes it really, really simple for me to go and build my URL. So if I create one more compose now, and I'm going to call this my flow run address, or flow run URL. So let's think, what were the key parts that I needed? I needed my fully qualified domain name to start off with, which I've got in a compose action up here. So let's go and grab it. So let's grab the outputs from my fully qualified domain name. I then had a /. What did I have next? I had manage, environments, and the environment name. So what have I got down here? I've got the environment name. So the next part can be static. From there, I can take the environment name, which, if we remember rightly, was called environment name. So let's use some dynamic content this time. And let's go and put the environment name in there. Then I had another /. Then I had flows. Let's just remind ourselves what come next. Then I had the actual flow ID itself, then runs, and then the run ID. So have I got an ID which corresponds to the actual flow ID? The answer is yes. And this time it's called the logic app. The logic app name. And then if I give it one more /, I can say runs. And then finally, the name. So that is now giving me a full URL that I can now start to look at to go and now immediately access that flow run. But let's just go and do something with it. Let's go and put it in my email. So this is the culprit. And I'm just going to switch that into HTML mode. Let's go and put some HTML in there so I can use my dynamic content. Okay, so again, let's use my outputs. And it's my flow run URL. Cool. So now, this combined URL that I've built up to be as dynamic as possible, I can now output as a URL in my catch email. So let's save it and let's test it. Okay, so I failed, but I've sent my email. My email comes through. I can see here that I've now got it in my email. So this is the culprit. What happens when I click it? It takes me directly to the flow that's failed. And if I see here how it's all built up, so I've got my fully qualified domain name. Remember, I've got all my flow info and I passed it so that I could start to use it as dynamic content. And when I built it all together, it gave me the URL, which matches what I see on the top of the script in my URL bar right now. So the really nice thing is, now that I've got that, I've got a reusable piece of a number of actions that I can just take and use in any of my other flows. So if I just copy to my clipboard, and I now go and create a new flow, and let's say when an item is created. So all I can do is come to new step, copy it, paste it in, and I've now got everything ready that I need. So building some support information at the start is one of the things I like to promote in my own flows as best practice, because it means that I've always got the flow run being built, and then if I need to, I can use it in multiple places. So it doesn't always have to be used just for errors. It could be used if you needed to output something, maybe for your own debugging purposes. But having it within a scope and built in this fashion means that it's as dynamic as possible. If I needed to take it to a different environment as an example, then all I would need to do is change my inputs, my fully qualified domain name, because the rest of it is figuring out the URL on its own. It's all based on dynamic content that I'm getting directly from the flow. So I hope that's been really useful. I hope that you start to maybe think about implementing that in your own flows, because it will make your life easy going forward, particularly now I can copy and paste it. If you do have any questions, please do feel free to post in the comments. Please feel free to like and subscribe, or reach out to me on Twitter at MattWeston365, or connect me on LinkedIn. Again, you can find me at MattWeston365, and I'll be happy to give you any assistance that I can. But in the final part of the series, we're going to go one step further, and we're going to also augment our emails with what the actual error is, what the failure was. So until then, stay safe, and I'll speak to you again soon.